Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 5 of Gilles Deleuze's Difference in Repetition. This is titled Asymmetrical Synthesis of the Sensible. And this is probably the last chapter I'll cover in this series. If this is the first video you're seeing of my coverage of Difference in Repetition, I've done a video on the other 4 chapters as well as the prologue and introduction. I probably won't do the conclusion just because I feel like this covers enough ground as is. Just anything else that I could add would just be, your time would be better spent by actually reading the book. But this 5th chapter is quite interesting because it basically accounts to a very philosophically dense dynamic systems theory. Deleuze is going to bring all of the stuff that he's talked about so far to focus mainly on the difference between intensive and extensive properties, as well as how change occurs in a system, how systems allow for the possibility of difference to emerge, how that difference may be subsumed, and what this means for the fate of the individual in a system. Now, I just want to start by, instead of going through a bunch of quotes, Deleuze kind of hints at this at various times, and he's talking about intensive versus extensive, intensity versus extensity throughout, but the way he presents it is sometimes very dense. So I think it's important to hint at how these are really two different ideas of difference. And an extensive property would be something like volume. Both of these different properties or qualities are relational. They happen as relations occur in a system. So, for example, a volume is differentiated from a different volume. So you can have, 3 milliliters of a liquid. And the reason you know what a milliliter is because you have liters, and these different units of volume come together to create what we know as volume. And extensive properties can be cut up. They are divisible. And when you do this, you cut up to a similar degree the quality of that thing. So for example, if you have 30 milliliters of a liquid and you kind of partition half that liquid and partition it off into 2 halves, you will now have 2 containers of 15 milliliters of liquid, right? So the quality of volume is itself divisible. Now, intensive properties are a little different. And there's lots of different intensive properties that he talks about. You've got surface tension, you've got force, you've got pressure, and you've got temperature. And temperature is kind of the best one to think about because you can't have a temperature. If I have a container with water that is at 50 degrees Celsius and I cut the water in half into 2 containers, it doesn't become the temperature of the water doesn't get cut in half. Both sides remain 50 degrees Celsius. And the reason for this, of course, is because temperature is an emergent phenomena that occurs because of the fundamental intensive properties of difference in each of the molecules of water, which are vibrating at a certain speed and in a certain manner that makes it have that temperature. So intensive properties testify to this fundamental force of difference that he's been talking about throughout. This is really the chaosmos as it presents itself in a dynamic system. So at the fundamental level, you have these intensive properties, which are really a difference of a difference. You've got different temperatures, right? But within temperature itself, it is itself a differentiating phenomenon of these shaking particles in Brownian motion, as well as another one. Another example of these intensive properties is surface tension. So for example, if you see water like hold to a leaf, even when like a drop of water goes underneath a leaf, it still manages to not drip off. It manages to stay on. And that's because of the surface tension of the water, which has to do with the way all these water molecules come together and the fundamental forces of attraction between the water molecules that give it this emergent property of surface tension. Now, all of this talk of intensive versus extensive properties is allowing Deleuze to explain how dynamic systems work, how it is that change is possible, and change is a result of these intensive properties, which have within them certain ranges, for example, that occur as a result of their situating in a system. So for example, you have like phase shifts that will occur in water as it turns to ice. It reaches a certain temperature and all the molecules undergo a sudden shift and their properties change. So there's kind of ranges of tolerance, so to speak, that intensive properties have, but of course only as a result of all these different molecules with these, qualities coming together and allowing for that emergent property. And with regards to how this is affecting the individual, in line with the stuff that he's been talking about previously with comedy and irony as these fundamental forces of uprooting, he says that paradox is the pathos or the passion of philosophy. Subjectively, paradox breaks up the common exercise of the faculties and places each before its own limit, before its incomparable. Thought before the unthinkable, which it alone is nevertheless capable of thinking. Memory before the forgotten, which is also its immemorial. Sensibility before the imperceptible, which is indistinguishable from its intensive. At the same time, however, paradox communicates to the broken faculties that relation which is far from good sense, aligning them along a volcanic line which allows one to ignite the other, leaping from one limit to the next. Objectively, paradox displays the element which cannot be totalized within a common element, along with a difference which cannot be equalized or cancelled at the direction of a good sense. And this force of paradox is something Deleuze is trying to pull out from the very ways in which physical properties interact with each other, and also this kind of actual versus virtual. And as a result, paradox allows for this fundamental breaking force to be actualized, like he's talking about with this volcanic line of leaping from one limit to the next. That's that change of state of water to ice or water to gas. There is a fundamental limit which occurs in water, for example, only as a result of it being engaged in a dynamic system, though. The particles don't inherently have this, they don't just have some common sense inside them that just thinks, oh, it's a certain temperature, now I'll change. No, it's precisely because those intensive qualities get actualized and realize a register shift when energy changes. Now, it might sound like just intensive properties are the important ones, but Deleuze wants to explicate that intensive properties are great and all, but through ideas, they extend out into a system, and particles act as a kind of locus. A black hole is what they call it, or a singularity in A Thousand Plateaus. Deleuze and Guattari is the they. And these act as local little centers from where difference is coming. And these, of course, have a kind of radius around them of effect. And as the system builds up all these different singularities from molecules, as you get a bunch of molecules together, the singularity starts to be an amalgamation, an average of all those. and you get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you get things like planets acting as singularities and black holes acting as singularities. And what is happening here is intensive properties are being covered up, but also divvied up and allocated in a more broad system. So extensive properties are important because they act as a sort of medium, and they act as a way of an intensive property, which is housed in like a molecule, for example, forming a kind of field of effect, so to speak. He writes on page 233, extension being precisely the process by which intensive difference is turned inside out and distributed in such a way as to be dispelled, compensated, equalized, and suppressed in the extensity which it creates. The important point is that the divisible is defined as that which bears in itself the unequal, whereas the indivisible, the same or the one, seeks to impose an equality upon it and thereby renders it docile. So the divisibility of extensive properties testifies to a fundamental inequality which is laden within extensive properties, which of course is difference. It is the fact that they have a differential force built into them, which, this is like Brownian motion, for example. It's just this propensity to differ, because difference is the motor of the world for Deleuze. It's what makes things work. And this difference gets extended, it gets equalized, sometimes it gets suppressed, but also it acts as a method by which that really strong and crushing force of the intensive properties gets extended. Now, there's always a little bit of a tenuous relationship in Deleuze's work to an ethics of sorts, and the way ethics is being used here with regards to Deleuze's work is it's a little bit different than the way you normally use it. But for example, Foucault says that anti-Oedipus in the prologue that he wrote, I think it was a prologue that he wrote to anti-Oedipus, where he calls it, the introduction to the anti-fascist lifestyle. And he says that this is the first book of ethics that's been written in the 20th century. And it's really testifying to a fundamental imperative that reality will obey whether or not we like it. That being the propensity for change and difference. And this is something that one may read Deleuze's philosophy and be like, well, he's talking about like the excitement of like deterritorialization in like Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus. But he doesn't have like some objective standard to ground this on or whatever. And in a sense, he does, precisely because, he's been theorizing on like the eternal return, for example, this fundamental kernel of difference at the very heart of what makes things breathe and move, which testifies to an ethics of nature of sorts. He writes on page 234 and 35, we must advance further at the risk of falling into an ethics of intensive quantities. Constructed on at least two series, one superior and one inferior, with each series referring in turn to other implicated series, intensity affirms even the lowest. It makes the lowest an object of affirmation. The power of a waterfall or a very deep descent is required to go that far and make an affirmation even of descent. Everything is like the flight of an eagle, overflight, suspension, and descent. Everything goes from high to low, and by that movement affirms the lowest, asymmetrical synthesis. High and low, moreover, are only a manner of speaking. It is a question of depth, and of the lower depth which essentially belongs to it. There is no depth which is not a seeker of a lower depth. It is there that distance develops, but distance understood as the affirmation of that which it distances, or difference as the sublimation of the lower. And really, this is almost Deleuze talking about Untergehen, of going under, as Nietzsche talks about it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, of if one wants to change, it's not a question of shooting for the sky for some pre-formulated hierarchy or ideal of how to do things. No, it's by accepting the power of the earth, which is to affirm the lowest. It is to descend down into the depths and craft, as it's called, a homemade atom bomb in 1,000 Plateaus. And this is really kind of framing Deleuze's talking about becoming minoritarian in 1,000 Plateaus. It's a question of not returning to, because it's not like a conservatism, it's just a refocusing on the molecular, on these fundamental intensities that are moving reality and seeing how they implicate each other, and how this leads to an affirmation of the force that acts on the small scale, so to speak. And it doesn't literally just have to be on the microscopic scale. This is sort of an analogy, too, that he's using, of merely affirming that fundamental difference which stands almost at the very interior of our city that is being. And on the outskirts, we've got all this stuff that is new, that is being volleyed in order to protect and solidify difference through extensive properties. But in reaffirming that depth of intensity, we allow for the possibility to actually undergo change. And in order to explain better what this kind of intensive kernel that I've been talking about is, he writes on page 236, more generally, every field of forces refers back to a potential energy. Every opposition refers to a deeper disparateness, and oppositions are resolved in time and extensity only to the extent that the disparates have first invented their order of communication in depth, and rediscovered that dimension in which they envelop one another, tracing hardly recognizable intensive paths through the ulterior world of qualified extensity. That's right. There is a little bit of an ethics here in the sense of trying to figure out the right path, trying to figure out, how to know your faces, as it's put in 1,000 Plateaus, and draw your lines of flight, of figuring out through this world of extensity, trying to reaffirm that potential energy, which is, of course, acting as the sort of ground state in in electricity has a ground state, right? He writes, it is intensity or difference in intensity which constitutes the peculiar limit of sensibility. As such, it has the paradoxical character of that limit. It is the imperceptible, that which cannot be sensed, because it is always covered by a quality which alienates or contradicts it, always distributed within an extensity which inverts and cancels it. In another sense, it is that which can only be sensed, or that which defines the transcendent exercise of sensibility, because it gives to be sensed, thereby awakening memory and forcing thought. So that's important. Intensity is getting covered up by extensity, right? It is being turned and re-territorialized, so to speak, and gains this function of, okay, there's a sort of relative stability that happens here as all these molecules come together, and then atoms and, or atoms and then molecules, and then, before you know it, you've got planets and stars with seemingly stable orbits, for example. But at the fundamental level, this intensity is what breathes sense, so to speak, into the processes that we see. It's what allows memory to be developed insofar as there is a fundamental intensity to grasp onto and establish that register like we have with the state of water. It has kind of a zone of comfortability, a territory where it can work. But after it reaches a certain temperature, it changes into ice or into gas. And all of this is Deleuze's way of talking about, quote, a natural remainder which provides the material for a change of nature. That's Deleuze's whole project right there. That's the reason difference is important to Deleuze. It is a natural remainder which cannot be totalized precisely because it is that ground state upon which extensity is built, which provides the material for a change of nature. And a material that itself is not static, but is defined by differentiation, defined by Brownian motion, by the tendency for change. And if you want to understand Deleuze's philosophy, there are a few of these kind of long sections that you get every once in a while. I can think of maybe 3 of them in 1,000 Plateaus. And we've got this one, which basically explicate his entire system right there in a very, delineated space. This is pages 240 and 241, and it's kind of long, but this is Deleuze's philosophy right here. If you're having trouble understanding what are flows in his philosophy, or what is energy, things like a temperature, for example, like these intensive qualities, what does that mean? What are intensive qualities if they're not defined by this relationality that defines extensive properties as they, create these spheres of influence? Well, how do we make sense of that fundamental internal differential force? So he writes, we define energy in terms of the difference buried in this pure intensity, and it is the formula difference of intensity which bears the tautology, but this time the beautiful and profound tautology of the different with a capital D. Energy, in general, will not then be confused with a uniform energy at rest, which would render any transformation impossible. Only a particular form of empirical energy, qualified in extensity, can be at rest. One in which the difference in intensity is already cancelled because it is drawn outside itself and distributed among the elements of the system. However, energy in general, or intensive quantity, is the spatium, the theater of all metamorphosis, or difference in itself which envelops all its degrees in the production of each. In this sense, energy, or intensive quantity, is a transcendent principle, not a scientific concept. Transcendental principle. That difference is important. In terms of the distinction between empirical and transcendental principles, an empirical principle is the instance which governs a particular domain. Every domain is a qualified and extended partial system governed in such a manner that the difference of intensity which creates it tends to be cancelled within it, law of nature. But the domains are distributive and cannot be added. There is no more an extensity in general than there is an energy in general within extensity. On the other hand, there is an intensive space with no other qualification, and within this space a pure energy. The transcendental principle does not govern any domain, but gives the domain to be governed to a given empirical principle. It accounts for the subjection of a domain to a principle. The domain is created by difference of intensity, and given by this difference to an empirical principle according to which and in which the difference itself is cancelled. So all this is very, very important stuff, and that difference between a transcendental principle and an empirical principle is important. So the transcendental principle is difference. I mean, it's right there. It's that force of intensity which tends to be swallowed up and canceled out, or rather averaged out, in the case of like laws of nature. So for example, when I was talking about planets and they have these relatively defined orbits that seem very stable, like they seem like they're never erring, that is a result of all the intensive properties, of all the little differences of every single molecule, of course, coming into contact and coming into a relationality in a dynamic system. And as such, the domain is created by difference of intensity. That's what he means there. And the domains are distributive and cannot be added, which, that might sound kind of weird. But what he's saying is that extensity itself, like there is no extensity in itself. Extensity is basically a product of intensive properties as they're volleyed in a system and kind of establish a sphere or a realm of confluence, so to speak, a territory, a solar system, a place of comfortability. And returning to the notion of ethics, and I touched on this in the last video with regards to some of the common misreadings of Deleuze. Deleuze is not advocating for this like mindless schizo philosophy. He's just not. If you read his stuff, especially if you read Difference and Repetition, which has that sort of schizo energy of Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, but it's much more explicitly academic and very structured and engaging with literature. And I mean, he's engaging with literature very in depth in those works as well with Guattari. But fundamentally, and Deleuze talks about this in 1,000 Plateaus, you'll find this in How Do You Make Yourself a Body Without Organs? You'll find it in Becoming Intense, Becoming Animal, Becoming Imperceptible. And it's the philosophy of the sober gesture. I think you'll also find it in the Refrain chapter. He is worried about figuring out how things make sense, how systems establish themselves and express themselves, mean something, communicate amongst its members, create this dynamic field of change. And as a result of this, because difference is this fundamental principle, yes, it is going to involve an ethics of sorts. He writes on page 244, the ethics of intensive quantities has only two principles. Affirm even the lowest. Do not explicate oneself too much. We must be like the father who criticized the child for having uttered all the dirty words he knew. Not only because it was wrong, but because he had said everything at once. Because he kept nothing in reserve, no remainder for the subtle, implicated matter of the eternal return. So there's this notion in like accelerationist readings of Deleuze that we should just be like absolutely deterritorializing, that we should just become completely 100% revolutionary, as if that made any sense in Deleuze's philosophy in the first place, because revolution is fundamentally a relational quality. You're revolutionary within a certain time and place and with regards to certain established ideas and thoughts and whatnot. But the eternal return, this kind of, this motor that is allowing difference to come back and be different each time. It's this gear, this motor of difference itself, of course, functions on that fundamental kernel of difference. So you can't get rid of that kernel. So if you want to best actualize change and become something new and interesting, you can't explicate yourself too much, which is to say, you can't lay everything out on the table too much. Deleuze continually talks in, I think it's in Becoming Intense, Becoming Animal, Becoming Imperceptible, in 1,000 Plateaus, about the importance of the secret, about keeping a little difference just for yourself, and how this plays into like tattoos and all this crazy stuff. It's a wild ride, that chapter. But the whole point here is to affirm that differential principle and don't get rid of it. And in terms of talking about how the individual relates to all this, the closest you'll get to talking about an individual is here. He writes on page 246, "The act of individuation consists not in suppressing the problem, but in integrating the elements of the disparateness into a state of coupling which ensures its internal resonance. The individual thus finds itself attached to a pre-individual half, which is not the impersonal within it so much as the reservoir of its singularities. In all these aspects, we believe that individuation is essentially intensive, and that the pre-individual field is a virtual ideal field made up of differential relations. Individuation is what responds to the question who, just as the idea responds to the questions how much and how. Who is always an intensity. Individuation, and this is the definition here as best as you'll get, is the act by which intensity determines differential relations to become actualized along the lines of differentiation and within the qualities and extensities it creates. So the closest we're going to get to a self here, because, right, Deleuze doesn't affirm this whole a priori self. He affirms this fundamentally fractured I, where here individuation, or the self, is integrated intensity in a problematic field. Those are my words, not his, but right, individuation is a matter of these lines of differentiation. Those are lines of flight. Those are what are the possibilities in which an intensive difference can make itself extensive in a field. So who is an intensive question, which is then actualized via certain differential relations being allowed to express themselves. And as he writes here on page 247, individuation does not presuppose any differentiation. It gives rise to it. Qualities and extensities, forms and matters, species and parts are not primary. They are imprisoned in individuals as though in a crystal. Moreover, the entire world may be read as though in a crystal ball, in the moving depth of individuating differences or differences in intensity. So this is really Deleuze expressing the selectivity of individuation, which gives rise to differentiation. So individuation is this essential force, really, which is the individual difference as such. It's pure difference as such, which becomes problematized in a dynamic system and has to become extensive, right? It has to express itself in some way and make itself known. And if you want to talk about dynamic systems, page 252 right here, this is your page. He writes, the individuating difference must not only be conceived within a field of individuation in general, but must itself be conceived as an individual difference. The form of the field must be necessarily and in itself filled with individual differences. This plenitude must be immediate, thoroughly precocious, and not delayed in the egg, to such a degree that the principle of indiscernibles would indeed have the formula given it by Lucretius: no two eggs or grains of wheat are identical. These conditions, we believe, are fully satisfied in the order of implication of intensities. Intensities presuppose and express only differential relations. Individuals presuppose only ideas. Furthermore, the differential relations within ideas are not more species, or genera, or families, etc., than their distinctive points form parts. They by no means constitute either qualities or extensions, On the contrary, all the ideas, all the relations with their variations and points coexist, even though there are changes of order according to the elements considered. They are fully determined and differentiated, even though they are completely undifferentiated. So this grafts on rather well to physics. In physics, not only do you have a dynamic field in which people are interacting with flows of electricity and computers and, whatever device you're listening to this on, and books and air and whatnot. But at the fundamental level, you have individual difference affirmed in the molecule. In Brownian motion, this kind of random motion that occurs with molecules. And as you get to the quantum level, it gets even more differentiable to the point where there is a moment of imperceptibility. This is devenir imperceptible from 1,000 Plateaus. And as such, intensities become implicated in an extensive quality and quantity, such that they are fundamentally this individuating difference, which is the plenitude of the molecular that is affirmed throughout Deleuze's philosophy, the different itself, which is going to allow for change. And thus, as he writes on 254, individuality is not a characteristic of the self, but on the contrary, forms and sustains the system of the dissolved self. That is super, super important if you want to understand becoming animal, for example, or becoming minoritarian, or devenir imperceptible, as I just said. We have a system of semi-stable connections, which is to say extensities, which form as a result of individuality of differences, which condition a field upon which particles can consolidate and establish what we take to be the self. And even though the self can undergo changes, even though you can urinate and defecate and intake food and breathe in and out air, you can still maintain some semblance of an identity. But semblance is the important word, because you are changing. You're changing all the time. And this is that disparateness of the self he wants to insist on, that fractured nature of the I, that the I doesn't exist unchanged. If you undergo trauma, you will fundamentally change. And this is really just making explicit a rather common occurrence of the change of the self that Deleuze is trying to focus on. And latent within the self, for Deleuze, is this possibility for approaching the limits of the self, and in so doing, altering this whole field that is the foundation, that is the sustainer of the semi-stable connections that make the self. He writes on 258, indeterminate, floating, fluid, communicative, and enveloping enveloped are so many positive characteristics affirmed by the individual. It is therefore insufficient to multiply selves or to attenuate the I in order to discover the true status of individuation. We have seen to what extent selves must be presupposed as a condition of passive organic syntheses, already playing the role of mute witnesses. However, the synthesis of time, which is carried out in them, refers precisely to other syntheses, as though to other witnesses, thereby leading us into the domain of another nature in which there is no longer either self or I, and in which, by contrast, we encounter the chaotic realm of individuation. For each self still retains some resemblance in this matter, while each I retains an identity, however attenuated. However, that which has its ground in dissemblance, or its lack of ground in a difference of difference, does not fit the categories of the I or the self. That's right. There are these fundamental limits of the self, and at the fundamental level, there is a communicative and fluid dynamic that allows the notion of the self to emerge, right? Your actual body is an amalgamation of different hormones and hemoglobin and air flowing in and out of your body and like lymph, and all of this stuff is coming together and making what it is to be you. But as such, there are these fundamental positive affirmations, which are the thousands of little tiny selves, the thousands of little differences that make you what you are, that testifies to your own dissolution. And thus, the power of ideas is synthesized with this notion of the dissolution of the self. When he writes, "It is ideas which lead us from the fractured I to the dissolved self. As we have seen, what swarms around the edges of the fracture are ideas in the form of problems. In other words, in the form of multiplicities made up of differential relations and variations of relations, distinctive points and transformations of points. These ideas, however, are expressed in individuating factors in the implicated world of intensive quantities, which constitute the universal, concrete individuality of the thinker or the system of the dissolved self." So there's that notion of the system of the dissolved self. That is probably the best in a very radical way of thinking about what it means to be an I. It's not, as he said before, trying to discover the true status of individuation by trying to this would be like a Hindu kind of interpretation of trying to get back to the divine self through communion with nature and trying to dissolve oneself into this abstract notion of the self with the capital S. No. It's not a matter of returning to some abstract self. It's a matter of finding all these thousands of little selves which are not the possibilities of being, but which are the actualities of being, which are testifying to your going under. So I hope that this has been helpful in talking about Deleuze's philosophy. Difference and Repetition is a wonderful work that I think you should definitely read. Very challenging, and as I've said before, it requires a lot of background, but it'll be well worth your while and will give you a lot of breadth of knowledge. So check out any of my other videos I've done on the rest of this work, on Deleuze and Guattari and other postmodernists, gender theory, German idealism. Leave any constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.